Alright, does antenatalism apply to other animals? Does it apply to animals bred by humans for consumption and companionship? Does it apply to animals not bred by humans? This is a very polarizing question even among those who identify themselves as antinatalists. There are many disagreements on this subject, and underlying to those disagreements are two different views of antinatalism. In this video, we'll look at those two different views, the underlying arguments of those views, and then see where it leads us further. One clarification though, we are not talking about environmental antinatalism, which is the idea that resources consumed by humans are causing a lot of environmental problems like climate change, and one of the best ways to reduce their impact on climate would be to not add another human being, another human consumer onto this planet. This reason to oppose procreation is very human-centric, because if tomorrow all the environmental problems are solved, there would be no reason for this view to exist. Ethical antinatalism, on the other hand, is based on harms and suffering of sentient life itself. And to whom all this ethical antinatalism applies is today's question. Now, I'm not talking about eugenics here, which is the idea that only certain groups of humans should or should not procreate based on certain arbitrary factors like race, religion, and so on. We start with the position that antinatalism includes all human beings, which is the members of the species Homo sapiens. The question then is, can it be extended beyond our species to other animals? The two views of antinatalism which is causing this debate are, one is that bringing someone into existence is morally wrong, and the other one is that coming into existence is bad. Now, by existence, I mean sentient existence, which is the existence with capacity to suffer. So, on the first view of bringing someone into existence being morally wrong, the focus is on those who are doing the act of procreation. We are saying that parents are doing something morally wrong. This assumes that parents have a capacity to decide between right and wrong. This capacity to decide between right and wrong is called moral agency, and those who have it are called moral agents. And so the argument goes that because other animals cannot make these decisions between right and wrong, they don't have this moral agency, antinatalism cannot include other animals, it can only be applied to human beings. But what about a couple who cannot understand the concept of morality, but can still reproduce sexually? Would we exclude such people from antinatalism? Many people in poor countries or those who are dominated by extreme religious beliefs don't usually have access to independent thinking. Even in many cases, many mentally healthy people, mentally healthy parents, are influenced by social norms, religious beliefs, restricted education, and poverty. So even though they have capacity to think or to decide between right and wrong, they cannot use that capacity effectively. Would we have to exclude such people from antinatalism? What about poor people in richer nations? What about accidental pregnancies? What about teenage pregnancies? And how far down the slippery slope can we go? Or to go to another extreme of the spectrum altogether, should we then say that antinatalism can only include the people who have all the resources in the world to make accurate moral decisions? To solve this problem, we need to look at why bringing somebody into existence is morally wrong in the first place. That brings us on to the underlying arguments for antinatalism. Now, typically they are philanthropic and misanthropic arguments. They are very elaborate arguments. I'll try and put some links in the description explaining the details of these arguments. But on a very high level, philanthropic arguments are those which are concerned about suffering of the being who is coming into existence. So, for example, Bennett's asymmetry compares the presence of harms and benefits of those who already exist to the absence of harms and benefits of those who don't exist but will be coming into existence. Similarly, optimism bias talks about our cognitive bias towards positive past experiences once we have come into existence. Risk argument talks about risks of life once we are here. Consent argument talks about impossibility of obtaining consent before we have come into existence. Misanthropic argument talk about the harms done by us to others once we have come into existence. So you see, all the underlying arguments of antinatalism actually focus on coming into existence. Even Bennett's book is called Better Never to Have Been and not Better Never to Bring Someone into Existence. That brings us on to the second view, that coming into existence is bad. This view does not need a moral agent. This does not care if parents had a moral agency, whether they were able to really decide between right and wrong. Coming into existence being bad in and of itself is enough to include all human beings into antinatalism. But then we are on another slippery slope here. Why to apply only to human beings? Why to draw the line on the level of the species Homo sapiens? Why can we not say that coming into existence is bad for all sentient beings? That is, anybody who can suffer, including other animals, including the animals bred by humans, as well as animals not bred by humans. Can we then say that antinatalism can include all other animals? Well, we need to evaluate if the underlying arguments for antinatalism also apply to other animals. Now, one word of caution, the actual titles of the arguments themselves, which are philanthropic and misanthropic, come from a root called anthropo, which in Greek means man or human. So the titles or names of the arguments are human-centric, but they can still be evaluated independently of what they're called. So in philanthropic argument, Bennett's asymmetry, I think very readily and severely applies to other animals. Animals which are bred in factory farms or for slaughterhouses definitely suffer extensively and before eventual slaughter by humans. That suffering would not have occurred to them had they not come into existence. Similarly, animals which are born into wild without any human assistance go through all kinds of sufferings. There are websites dedicated just for wild animal suffering, and I'll put some links in the description for them. But the point is, they do suffer. That suffering would not have occurred to them had they not also not come into existence. One point to note is that Bennett's asymmetry is a person-affecting view. What that means is that it is not an impersonal view that, if there is some space where no suffering exists, that's good. It says that absence of suffering is good from the perspective of the being who is going to save from that suffering. So those who draw the line between animals who are bred by humans and animals who are not bred by humans and try and apply antinatalism only to one category need to look at this example. Let's take an example of a buffalo whose throat is being slit by humans in a slaughterhouse and compare that to another buffalo who is being eaten alive by lions. Now, point taken that there are differences here. Lions are doing it out of compulsion. They don't have any other option for their survival. Humans can have different choices, especially modern humans. So if they are doing it, even then it's unnecessary suffering. So there are differences. But from the perspective of buffalo, right? Does it matter whether she's being eaten alive by lions or whether she's being slaughtered by humans? She still suffers. And suffering is what matters to her. Correct? So from her perspective, it would have been better if she had not come into existence, so that she would have been saved from that suffering. And so for that reason, I don't see a reason to make this distinction between animals which are bred by humans and not bred by humans when talking about including them into antinatalism, especially when we're talking Bennett's asymmetry here. Optimism bias is a little tricky one. At the time of making this video, I could not find any study which proved or disproved existence of optimism bias in animals which were not trained for any specific behavior. But risk argument definitely applies to animals. Animals in slaughterhouses and factory farms at risks of different kinds of suffering before eventual slaughter by humans. Animals in wild are at risk of predation, starvation, disease, parasitism, sexual coercion, competition for resources, you name it. Like a whole documentary can be made just on risks faced by animals in the wild. So it definitely applies to other animals. Consent is a human concept, but I think the fact still remains that none of the animals ever to have been born on this planet ever would have consented before being born, because that's just impossible. So consent argument applies to other animals. Misanthropic argument could apply to other animals only to a limited extent. You can say that existence of a lion or the fact of coming into existence of a lion is bad for all the zebras that lion is going to kill in their lifetime. Similarly, coming into existence of a new zebra can be said to be bad for all other existing zebras because it adds to the competition for already existing zebras for resources. So misanthropic argument applies to a limited extent to other animals. So you see, of the 5 underlying arguments for antinatalism, at least 4 apply to other animals. So that indicates to me that we can include other animals within the scope of antinatalism. But we must also think about other actions which we think as morally wrong in human world and don't necessarily apply to other animals. Let's take an example of theft. Now, we have a view that stealing is morally wrong, but we don't apply it to other animals, even though theft is very common in other animals. So when we see a bunch of hyenas stealing prey from hunted lions, we try and justify it, saying that that's just nature, that's just how nature works. Now, whether that justification is enough or not is a different matter. But the fact that we're trying to justify it indicates that we think that stealing is bad. So we can merge these two views and say that stealing is morally wrong because stealing is bad, because stealing causes harm to the one being stolen from, whether or not a moral agent exists or not. Similarly, we can merge two views of antinatalism and say that bringing someone into existence is morally wrong because coming into existence is bad, because coming into existence causes harm to the one who is come into existence, whether or not there was a moral agent involved or not. And so for that reason, I don't think there is any other term or label needed to include all sentient beings into antinatalism. Just antinatalism is enough.